"We will steer wherever you wish to go," replied one of the men, with a wink at his companions. "Then sail back to Naxos, for that is my home," said the youth. The sailors promised to do so, but turned the ship towards Egypt, where they hoped to sell their prize for a large sum in gold. Acetes made several brave attempts to get possession of the helm and steer for Naxos, but the sailors struck him down and threatened to throw him overboard if he interfered in their plans. Soon the lad seemed to notice that the familiar shores were receding, and anxiously inquired if they were really sailing towards Naxos. He begged them not to ill-treat a friendless boy, but to let him return home in safety. Then the crew, weary of their pretence, told him brutally that he was being taken to Egypt to be sold as a slave, and that he could try his pretty speeches on his future master. The youth did not reply to these taunts, but looked calmly at the jeering sailors, and raised his hand above his head. Immediately the ship stopped, as if it had been suddenly rooted to the sea, and though the men pulled frantically at the oars, not an inch could the vessel move. Then, as in a dream, they saw ivy twining rapidly about the sails and wrapping the oars in its strong tendrils. A vine with its heavy clusters of grapes clung to the mast and the sides of the ship. There was the delicious smell of crushed fruit in the air, and the fragrance of new-made wine. The sailors stared at the transformed ship and at the captured youth, who now shook off his mask of simplicity and appeared before them in all his godlike beauty. For it was no other than the divine Baccus, whom they had derided and hoped to sell as a slave. The sound of flutes was heard all around him, and the shrill notes of the pipes. At the feet of Baccus crouched tigers, lynxes, and panthers, and the god himself bore in his hand a staff wreathed with ivy. Then terror seized the trembling sailors, and they sprang madly over the side of the ship. But as soon as they touched the water, they were changed into dolphins. Only Acetes was left standing on the deck before the smiling Baccus, who bade him have no fear, but take the helm and steer straight for Naxos. The pilot gladly obeyed, and soon reached the desired port, where he left his ship and became a follower of the god of wine. When Acetes finished this remarkable story, King Pentheus swore that not a word of it was true, and ordered his prisoner to be taken away at once and executed. The soldiers threw Acetes into a jungle, but while the preparations for his execution were being made, his chains suddenly dropped off, and his prison doors flew open. When the jailers came to lead him to his death, he was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile the king had learned that the people were thronging around Baccus on the Cithaeron mountains just outside the city, and were eagerly joining in all the joyous rites that attended the worship of the god of wine. The shouts of the Bacchanals filled the air, and in spite of his anger against them, Pentheus was curious to see what these ceremonies were that occasioned such roisterous mirth. So he disguised himself as a beggar, and joined the shouting crowd that surrounded Baccus and his followers. The noisiest of the revellers were the Bacchantes, who danced and sang in a very frenzy of excitement as they tossed their ivy wreaths into the air and poured the red wine recklessly upon the ground. When this group, flushed with wine and half-clad, whirled madly toward him, the king was astonished to see among them his own mother Agave. As he leaned nearer to the shouting dancers, wondering how his mother came to join in such orgies, she suddenly saw him, and pointing a finger at his shrinking figure, cried, "There is the monster who prowls in our woods. Come on, sisters, I will be the first to strike the wild boar." Blinded by the madness that Baccus had purposely inspired, she rushed upon the terrified king, followed by the crowd of half-crazed Bacchantes. In vain did Pentheus cry out that he was her son. Agave and her companions trampled him down in their fierce onslaught, and in a moment tore him to pieces. Thus was the worship of Baccus established in Greece. The spot that the god of wine loved best was the island of Naxos, and here he spent much of his time when he was not wandering over the earth to teach the art of making wine. One day Baccus was walking on the seashore with his ivy-crowned company, who followed him, singing and dancing to the music of their shrill pipes. As they neared a spot where the rocks rise like a cliff above the water's edge, they discovered a maiden sitting on the white sand. This was Ariadne, who had been deserted by her lover Theseus, and left to pine away alone on the island. For days Ariadne had sat looking mournfully out over the sea, and now when Baccus with his joyous group of revellers suddenly broke in upon the silence of her solitude, she was frightened by the sight of so many strangers. Bacchus soothed her fears, and in a short time so won the maiden's confidence that he persuaded her to become his wife. Ariadne was quite content to stay on the island with such a merry company, and if she ever felt any regret over the faithless Theseus, it was soon forgotten in the joy of the wedding celebrations, which lasted for several days. As a marriage gift, Bacchus placed on Ariadne's white forehead a crown adorned with 7 glittering stars, but wonderful as it was, it did not eclipse the beauty of the wearer. The happiness of the newly wedded pair did not last long, however, for in a few months Ariadne sickened and died. After her death, Bacchus left the island and did not return there for many years. But before he set sail he took Ariadne's crown and threw it up into the sky, where it forms a brilliant constellation known as Corona. One day Silenus fell asleep in the forest, and his companions, believing him safe for a while, went away and left him propped up against a tree with his wine bag at his side. Here he was found by some peasants who were subjects of Midas, king of Lydia. The rustics watched the sleeping Silenus for a long time, wondering who he might be. At length the old man woke up, and after rubbing his eyes asked the staring peasants where he was. As he received no answer to his question, Silenus motioned to the rustics to help him up, and then started to hunt for Bacchus and his lost companions. Seeing him unable to walk, the men led him to the court of King Midas, who, as soon as he saw the wanderer's jolly red face and his body, half goat and half man, knew at once that it was Silenus, the tutor of Bacchus. This Midas was the same king who had challenged Apollo to compete in the musical contest with Pan, and because of his unfair decision had been cursed with ass's ears by the offended god. The fact that Silenus had ears unlike the average mortal may have made King Midas feel a bit more sympathy for the old man's distress, but whatever the reason might be, he entertained Silenus royally for 10 days, and then led him back to his pupil, who had been wondering at his long absence. Delighted to have Silenus return to him unharmed, Bacchus promised to give the king any reward he might name, and Midas, being very avaricious, asked the god to grant that all that he touched should turn into gold. Bacchus had hoped that Midas would desire a better gift than this, but having made a promise, the god was ready to fulfill it, and he therefore assured the king that his wish was granted. Midas, overjoyed at his good fortune, hastened back to his palace, and on the way he hesitatingly tried his new power. He touched some leaves that hung from the trees near by, and immediately they became golden. He took up a stone from the roadway, and it turned into gold in his hand. He plucked an apple, and in a moment it looked like one of the golden fruit from the garden of the Hesperides. Midas was almost beside himself with joy, and as soon as he reached his palace he began at once to turn all its furnishings into gold. He was so delighted with this wonderful gift that he felt no desire to eat or to drink or rest, but at last he grew a little weary of turning things into gold, and being hungry, sat down at his well-filled table. He took great pleasure in seeing the cloth and the cups and the plates change as everything else had done at his touch, but to his great amazement and horror he also found that the bread he took in his hand, the food that touched his lips, turned into hard, unyielding gold. He tried to drink from the shining cups, but the wine in his mouth became melted gold. Then Midas knew the real meaning of his magic touch, and realized sorrowfully that until it was taken away he would slowly starve in the midst of his great wealth. Already he hated his gift, and longed for some way to divest himself of his ill-fated power. He cried aloud to Bacchus for help, but no answer came to his prayers. Again he besought the god, and this time acknowledged his avarice and lamented the greed that had led him to ask for the gift of the golden touch. Bacchus heard his prayers, and believing him truly repentant, commanded him to go to the river Pactolus, trace the stream to its source, and plunge his head and body into the purifying water. In this way he would cleanse himself of his fault and its punishment. Midas did as he was instructed, and came away from the river a wiser and happier, though a poorer man. If at any time he was ever tempted to regret his lost gift, he had only to look into the river at the glittering golden sand on the bed of the stream, for where the king had stood the sand was changed into gold, and so it has remained to this very day.